The mountain man stood frozen on the ridge above Tonopah, Nevada, watching a woman in a faded blue dress carry 2 empty buckets down the dusty road, her figure growing smaller as she walked toward the distant creek that marked the edge of the parched valley in the summer of 1882. Kade Brennan had been tracking an elk through these hills for the better part of the morning, but the sight of that solitary figure trudging through the heat made him forget about the hunt entirely. He had seen plenty of hardship in his 30 years, most of it carved into his own scarred hands and weathered face, but something about the determination in her stride and the impossible distance she had yet to cover made his chest tighten with a feeling he could not name. He lowered his rifle and squinted against the brutal Nevada sun. The woman was too far away for him to make out her features, but he could see the way she paused every few minutes to shift the wooden buckets from one hand to the other. The creek was at least 3 miles from the cluster of ramshackle buildings that made up the eastern edge of Tonopah, and she would have to make the return journey carrying water that would weigh her down with every step. Kade ran a hand through his shoulder-length dark hair, still damp with sweat from the climb. His muscles ached from days in the wilderness, and his buckskin shirt clung to his broad shoulders. He had come into the high country to escape the noise and complications of town, preferring the company of pine trees and mountain streams to the crowded saloons and dusty streets below. But now, as he watched the woman disappear into the heat shimmer on the horizon, he felt something pull at him, an instinct that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with the ache of seeing someone struggle alone. He made his decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Slinging his rifle over his shoulder, he started down the rocky slope toward Tonopah, his long legs eating up the distance with the easy grace of a man who had spent more time in the mountains than in civilization. His mind was already working through the logistics, calculating what he would need and how long it would take. The sun was past its zenith, which gave him maybe 8 hours until full dark, and another 10 or 12 until dawn. It would be tight, but Kade Brennan had never been a man to shy away from hard work, especially not when it mattered. By the time he reached the outskirts of town, his plan had solidified into something concrete and achievable. He needed tools, and he needed information. The first was easy enough, but the second required him to talk to people, which was never his strong suit. Still, he pushed through the door of Morrison's general store with the same determination that had carried him through blizzards and bear attacks. The proprietor, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a nervous habit of wiping his hands on his apron, looked up from his ledger with surprise. "Mr. Brennan, did not expect to see you back in town so soon. Need some supplies, Mr. Morrison." Kade's voice was deep and roughened from disuse. He did not waste time on pleasantries. "Looking for a good shovel, pickaxe if you have one, and any well-digging equipment you might have in stock." Morrison's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline. "Well digging, that is quite an undertaking. You planning to settle somewhere, something like that?" Kade moved through the store with purpose, his eyes scanning the shelves and corners for what he needed. He found a sturdy shovel with an iron blade, then a pickaxe that had seen some use but still had good weight to it. "I'll need rope too." "Strong hemp, about 50 feet. I have got that." Morrison scurried to the back of the store, returning with a coil of rope that looked like it would hold. "Anything else? You will need water while you work and probably some food if this is going to take you a while." Kade nodded, already thinking ahead. "Jerky, hard biscuits, whatever travels well, and a couple of canteens." While Morrison gathered the supplies, Kade allowed himself to ask the question that had been building since he came down from the hills. "There is a woman living on the east side of town. Saw her heading toward the creek this morning with buckets. You know who I am talking about, Morrison paused, his expression shifting into something more guarded. That would be Vera Josephs. Moved here about 6 months back, maybe a little more. Keeps to herself mostly. She live alone. Far as I know. Her husband died somewhere back east, I think. She came out here trying to make a fresh start, but it has not been easy for her. Morrison set a package of jerky on the counter, followed by a small sack of biscuits. The cabin she is renting is on old Henderson land. He was planning to develop that area, but the water situation made it impractical. Most folks will not live that far from the main well. Kade felt a familiar anger kindle in his chest, the kind that came from seeing injustice that could be remedied if people just cared enough to try. Why has no one dug a well out there? Henderson does not see the point if he cannot sell the land. And Miss Josephs, well, she does not have the money to hire someone to do it. It is a hard thing, but that is how it goes sometimes. Morrison rang up the purchases, his fingers moving quickly over the keys of his cash register. That will be $8.40. Kade paid without complaint, though it took a significant portion of the money he had earned from his last load of furs. He gathered up the tools, slinging the rope over his shoulder and balancing the pickaxe and shovel in his other hand. The supplies went into his pack, already heavy with his camping gear. "You planning what I think you are planning?" Morrison asked as Kade headed for the door. "Depends on what you think I am planning. If you are going to dig that woman a well, you have got a long night ahead of you. The water table is not too deep in that area, maybe 30 feet, but that is still a lot of earth to move." Kade turned back, his blue eyes steady and calm. "Then I better get started." He left the store and made his way through town, ignoring the curious looks from the few people out in the afternoon heat. Tonopah was not a large place, maybe 200 souls on a good day, and most of them knew him by reputation if not by face. The mountain man who came down from the hills a few times a year to trade furs and buy supplies. The quiet giant who never caused trouble but had the look of a man who could end trouble quickly if it found him. The eastern edge of town was exactly as Morrison had described, a collection of run-down cabins and half-finished structures that Henderson had abandoned when his development plans fell through. Kade scanned the area, looking for signs of recent habitation. It did not take long to spot the cabin that had to be Vera Josephs' place. The small structure had been recently repaired, with new boards patching holes in the walls and a fresh layer of tar on the roof. A tiny vegetable garden struggled to survive in the hard, packed earth beside the door, the plants wilting despite someone's clear efforts to keep them watered. The cabin was empty, which was what Kade had expected. She would still be at the creek, filling those buckets and preparing for the long walk back. He had maybe 2 hours before she returned, which was not enough time to finish the well, but was enough to make serious progress. The important thing was to pick the right spot. Kade studied the area with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years reading the land. He needed to find the place where the water table was closest to the surface, which usually meant looking for certain types of vegetation and changes in the soil composition. He walked in a widening circle around the cabin, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The ground was hard and dry, baked by weeks of summer heat, but there were subtle signs if you knew how to look. About 20 feet from the cabin door, he found what he was searching for. The earth here had a slightly different color, a hint of darker soil beneath the pale surface dust. A few scrubby plants grew in a cluster, their leaves less wilted than the surrounding vegetation. It was not much, but it was enough to suggest that water was closer here than elsewhere. He set down his pack and began to work. The first few feet were the hardest, breaking through the sun-hardened crust of earth and caliche that topped the soil. Kade swung the pickaxe with steady, powerful strokes, feeling the impact jar through his shoulders and arms. Sweat soaked through his shirt within minutes, and he stripped it off, working in just his pants and boots. His body was a map of old scars and hard-won muscle, the kind that came from years of physical labor rather than idle vanity. As he dug deeper, the earth became slightly easier to work, though still tough and resistant. He used the shovel to clear away the loose soil, piling it in a neat mound beside the growing hole. His mind fell into the rhythm of the work, the same way it did when he was chopping wood or hauling water or any of the other countless tasks that filled his days in the mountains. There was something meditative about it, something that let him think clearly without the noise of words getting in the way. He thought about the woman walking those miles to the creek. He thought about the determination it must take to do that every day, to refuse to give up even when the situation seemed impossible. He thought about what it meant to be that alone, that far from help, and still find the strength to keep going. Kade did not consider himself a sentimental man. He had left sentiment behind years ago when he lost his family to cholera, and decided that the wilderness was a better companion than civilization. But something about Vera Josephs had gotten under his skin, had reached past the walls he had built and touched something he thought was long dead. The sun crawled across the sky, marking the passage of time with the shifting shadows. Kade worked without stopping, pushing himself harder as the hole grew deeper. His hands blistered and bled, the soft calluses from his normal work not quite tough enough for this kind of sustained abuse. He ignored the pain, wrapping his hands in strips of cloth torn from an old shirt and continuing. At 10 feet down, he hit a layer of rock that required the pickaxe and considerable effort to break through. At 15 feet, his arms were shaking with fatigue, and he had to rest, sitting on the edge of the hole with his legs dangling into the darkness below. He drank water from one of his canteens, the liquid barely touching the deep thirst that had settled into his bones. The light was fading when he heard the sound of footsteps on the path. Kade looked up, wiping the sweat and dirt from his face, and saw her for the first time up close. Vera Josephs was younger than he had expected, maybe 25 or 26, with honey-colored hair pulled back in a simple bun and eyes the color of sage in summer. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, and her dress was stained with sweat and dust, but there was a beauty to her that went beyond surface appearances. It was in the set of her shoulders, the tilt of her chin, the way she carried those heavy buckets as if they weighed nothing at all. She stopped when she saw him, her eyes widening in surprise and something that might have been fear. "Who are you? What are you doing on my property?" Kade stood slowly, very aware that he must look like something from a nightmare, shirtless and covered in dirt with blood seeping through the cloth wrapped around his hands. "Name is Kade Brennan. I am digging you a well." She set down the buckets, water sloshing over the rims. "You are doing what?" "A well." He gestured to the hole behind him, now nearly 20 feet deep. "Saw you walking to the creek this morning. That is too far to go for water. Figured you needed a well closer to home." Vera stared at him, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Finally, she managed, "I did not hire anyone to dig a well. I cannot afford to pay you. Did not ask for payment." "Then why would you do this?" It was a fair question, and Kade did not have a good answer, at least not one he could put into words. He looked at her for a long moment, taking in the confusion and suspicion in her eyes, the way she held herself as if ready to run or fight depending on what happened next. He understood that wariness. A woman alone had every reason to be cautious around strange men. "Because it needed doing," he said finally, "and because no one else was going to do it." She took a step closer, peering into the hole he had excavated. "How deep does it need to be? 30 feet, give or take, maybe a bit more depending on where the water table is. And you think you can finish it by yourself? Already more than halfway there. Vera looked at him again, really looked at him, and Kade saw the moment her suspicion began to shift into something else. Not quite trust, but a cautious willingness to believe that maybe he was exactly what he appeared to be, a man trying to help. "You have been working all afternoon," she said quietly. "You must be exhausted. I have been more tired. Have you eaten? Some?" She shook her head, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth despite the strangeness of the situation. "Wait here. Let me get you something proper." Before he could protest, she picked up her buckets and carried them toward the cabin. Kade watched her go, noting the way she moved with economical grace, wasting no energy on unnecessary motion. She disappeared inside, and he heard the sound of dishes clinking and a stove being lit. He returned to the well, climbing down into the hole with the rope tied around his waist for safety. The work was harder now in the fading light, and he had to feel his way more than see what he was doing. But his body remembered the rhythm, and he fell back into the steady pattern of swing, lift, swing, lift. 20 minutes later, Vera appeared at the edge of the hole. "Mr. Brennan, I have got food ready if you want to take a break." Kade looked up at her silhouette against the darkening sky. "Be up in a minute." He climbed out using the rope, his arms protesting every inch of the ascent. By the time he reached the surface, he was breathing hard, and the muscles in his back were knotted with fatigue. Vera handed him a damp cloth without a word, and he used it to wipe the worst of the dirt from his face and chest. She had set out a simple meal on a wooden crate near the cabin door. Beans, cornbread, and a cup of coffee that was still steaming in the cool evening air. It was not fancy, but it was real food, the kind that would put strength back into his body. "Thank you," Kade said, settling onto the ground beside the crate. His manners were rusty from years in the mountains, but he tried to remember what his mother had taught him about eating in the presence of a lady. Vera sat across from him, her own plate balanced on her knees. "I still do not understand why you are doing this. You want me to stop?" "No." The word came out quickly, almost desperately, and she blushed. "No, I just want to understand. Men do not usually help without expecting something in return." Kade chewed slowly, considering his words. "I live up in the mountains most of the time, do not come to town much except to trade. But I saw you this morning walking with those buckets, and I could not stop thinking about how far you had to go. It did not seem right. So you decided to dig me a well." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, her eyes searching his face. "Are you real? Or am I so tired that I am imagining you? I am real." That is what an imaginary person would say. Despite himself, Kade felt a smile tug at his lips. "I suppose that is true." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the sounds of the desert night rising around them. Crickets chirped in the scrub brush, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the emerging stars. Kade felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease, though whether from the food or the company he could not say. "My husband died 2 years ago," Vera said suddenly, her voice soft but steady. "Cholera outbreak in Missouri. I stayed for a while, trying to make it work, but everything there reminded me of him. When I heard about opportunities in Nevada, I thought maybe I could start over, build something new. I am sorry for your loss." "Thank you." She set down her plate and wrapped her arms around her knees. "Coming here was harder than I expected. The land is not like what I am used to, and the water situation, well, you saw that for yourself. But I am not ready to give up yet." "Do not think you are the giving up type." "What makes you say that?" "Anyone who walks 6 miles for water every day is not a quitter." She laughed, a sound that was equal parts amusement and exhaustion. I suppose that is one way to look at it. Most days it just feels like stubbornness. Nothing wrong with stubborn. No, she agreed. I suppose there is not. Kade finished his meal and stood, his body already protesting the movement. I should get back to work. Want to hit water before sunrise if I can. You are going to work through the night. That was the plan. Vera stood as well, gathering up the plates. That is insane. You will kill yourself. I will be fine, Mr. Brennan. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the concern in her eyes. I appreciate what you are doing more than I can say, but I do not want you to hurt yourself for my sake. The well can wait another day. Rather finish it tonight. Why? What difference does one more day make? Kade met her gaze, and for a moment, he considered telling her the truth, that he could not stand the thought of her making that long walk again, that something in him had fundamentally shifted when he saw her struggling alone. But those words felt too big, too revealing for someone he had just met. Like to finish what I start, he said instead. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but I am going to help. You do not have to do that. I know I do not have to, I want to. She moved toward the well, looking down into the darkness. Tell me what to do. Kade wanted to argue, wanted to send her inside to rest, but he could see the determination in her face, the same stubborn strength that had carried her through loss and hardship. Who was he to deny her the chance to work for her own well? Can you manage the rope? He asked. I will tie the buckets to it, fill them with dirt, and you can haul them up. I can do that. They worked together as the night deepened around them. Kade climbed back into the hole, now nearly 25 feet deep, and filled bucket after bucket with the earth he excavated. Vera hauled them up with steady determination, dumping the dirt onto the growing pile and sending the empty buckets back down. They developed a rhythm, a wordless communication that made the work go faster than Kade would have managed alone. The moon rose, casting silver light across the desert and illuminating the scene with an otherworldly glow. Kade's arms were on fire, every muscle screaming for rest, but he pushed through it, driven by something deeper than physical endurance. Above him, he could hear Vera's breathing, the soft sounds of effort as she worked the rope, and it gave him strength he did not know he had. At 28 feet, his shovel struck something different, a layer of damp earth that clung to the blade. His heart rate picked up and he dug faster, clearing away the soil with new urgency. 29 feet, and the dampness increased. 30 feet, and water began to seep into the bottom of the hole, cold and clear and beautiful. I hit it, he called up, his voice hoarse from hours of silence. We have got water. Vera's face appeared over the edge, illuminated by moonlight and joy. Really, we did it, we did it. She laughed, the sound bright and genuine, and Kade felt something in his chest expand, a warmth that had nothing to do with the physical exertion. He climbed out of the well, every inch an agony, and collapsed on the ground beside it, his chest heaving and his body trembling with exhaustion. Vera knelt beside him, her hand hovering over his shoulder as if she wanted to touch him but was not sure if she should. Are you all right? Just need a minute. You need more than a minute. You need a week of rest and probably a doctor. I have been through worse. That does not mean this is not bad. She stood and returned a moment later with one of the buckets of water she had carried from the creek, along with the damp cloth. Let me see your hands. Kade held them out, wincing as she unwrapped the bloody cloth and revealed the torn skin beneath. The blisters had burst hours ago, leaving raw flesh that would take weeks to heal properly. Vera cleaned them gently, her touch feather light but efficient. You did this for me, she said quietly, not looking at his face. You destroyed your hands digging this well for a complete stranger. They will heal. That is not the point. She finished wrapping his hands in fresh cloth, her fingers lingering on his wrists. Why would you do something like this?" Kade looked at her, at the way the moonlight caught in her hair and turned it to silver gold, at the emotions playing across her face too fast to name. He thought about all the things he could say, all the ways he could deflect or change the subject. But sitting there in the cool desert night with his body broken from effort and her hands warm on his skin, he found he did not want to hide anymore. "Because when I saw you walking with those buckets, something in me recognized something in you," he said, the words coming slowly but honestly. "I have spent the last 5 years alone in those mountains, telling myself that it was better that way, that I did not need anyone or anything except the wild. But then I saw you, and I realized I had been lying to myself. I dug you this well because I wanted to take away even a small part of your burden. And maybe because I hoped that if I did, you might let me stay long enough to get to know the woman who is strong enough to walk 6 miles for water and still have the energy to smile." Vera's breath caught, her eyes wide and shining in the moonlight. "You are not at all what I expected. Is that good or bad? I have not decided yet." But she was smiling as she said it, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her whole face. "You can stay for a while if you want. I think I would like to get to know you too." Kade felt something tight in his chest loosen, something that had been knotted there since long before he saw her on that dusty road. "I would like that." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the water seep into the bottom of the new well. The night was cool and clear, perfect in a way that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the feeling of possibility that hung in the air between them. As the first hints of dawn began to color the eastern horizon, Kade stirred. "I should finish the well. Needs a proper lining to keep the walls from collapsing and a bucket system to draw water." "Not tonight," Vera said firmly. "Tonight you are going to sleep, and we are going to figure out the rest tomorrow. I do not want to impose. You just dug me a well in one night. I think I can spare you a blanket and a place to rest." She stood and offered him her hand, pulling him to his feet with surprising strength. "Come on, mountain man. Let me take care of you for a change." Kade followed her into the small cabin, too tired to argue and too grateful to want to. She made up a bedroll near the stove, the warmest spot in the single-room structure, and brought him water and a clean shirt that had belonged to her late husband. He changed out of his filthy clothes and lay down, feeling his body sink into the blankets as if he were made of stone. Vera settled into her own bed on the other side of the room, maintaining a respectful distance. "Mr. Brennan, Kade," he corrected, his voice already thick with approaching sleep. "Just Kade." "Kade, then, thank you for everything. You are welcome, Vera." He drifted off to the sound of her breathing, steady and peaceful. And for the first time in 5 years, he did not dream of the family he had lost. Instead, he dreamed of water rising in a well, of silver moonlight and sage-colored eyes, and of the possibility that maybe loneliness was not a permanent condition after all. The next few days fell into a pattern that surprised both of them with its ease and comfort. Kade stayed to finish the well properly, lining it with stones he quarried from a nearby outcropping, and building a sturdy bucket system with wood and rope purchased from Morrison's store. Vera helped where she could, learning the work with the same determination she brought to everything else. And slowly, they began to know each other. They talked while they worked, sharing stories from their pasts in fragments and glimpses. Kade learned that Vera had been married young to a kind man who dreamed of building a farm in Missouri. But those dreams died with him in the cholera ward. She learned that Kade had once had a wife and a baby daughter, lost to the same disease in a different outbreak years earlier, and that the mountains had been his refuge when grief made civilization unbearable. "You miss it?" she asked one afternoon as they took a break from working on the well. The life you had before, Kade considered the question, his eyes distant. Every day. But missing it does not change what is. I learned to live with the loss, to find a different kind of purpose in the wild places. But you came down from the mountain to dig me a well. I did. So maybe you are ready to live among people again. He looked at her, at the hope and hesitation in her expression. Maybe I am, if the right person gave me a reason. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with possibilities neither of them was quite ready to name. Vera broke eye contact first, a blush rising in her cheeks. We should get back to work. Yes, Kade agreed, though he made no move to rise. We should. By the end of the week, the well was complete and producing clear, cold water that tasted of minerals and earth. Vera drew the first bucket with ceremony, her face bright with joy as she poured water into a cup and drank deeply. It is perfect, better than the creek water. Should last you for years if you maintain it properly. Teach me how. So Kade spent another few days showing her the intricacies of well maintenance, how to check the stone lining for cracks, how to keep the bucket system in good repair, how to tell if the water was staying clean. They worked side by side in the Nevada heat, their shoulders brushing occasionally, each touch a reminder of the growing connection between them. On the 10th day, Kade announced that he should head back to the mountains. His supplies were running low, and he had left his camp unattended for longer than he ever had before. Vera nodded, her expression carefully neutral, but he could see the disappointment in her eyes. "Will you come back?" she asked as he packed his gear. "If you want me to, I do." The words were simple, but they carried weight. "I want you to." Kade reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his bandaged fingers gentle despite their roughness. "Then I will come back. Give me 2 weeks to handle things up in the high country and I will return. 2 weeks. I promise." He kept his word. 14 days later, as the sun set over Tonopah, Kade Brennan rode into town on a sturdy mountain horse, his pack laden with fresh furs and supplies. He went straight to Vera's cabin, his heart beating faster than it had any right to as he approached the small structure with its new well standing proud beside the door. Vera was in her garden, coaxing life from the stubborn earth with water she no longer had to carry for miles. She looked up at the sound of his horse, and her face broke into a smile so radiant that Kade felt his breath catch. "You came back. Told you I would." She set down her watering can and crossed the distance between them, moving slowly as if afraid he might disappear if she moved too fast. "I was not sure you would. I do not break my promises." "No," she said softly, looking up at him with those sage-colored eyes. "I do not think you do." Kade dismounted, his body remembering the ache of the well digging but healed enough now that it did not slow him down. He pulled a package from his saddlebag and handed it to her. "Brought you something." Vera unwrapped the bundle carefully, revealing a beautifully tanned deer hide, soft as butter and perfect for making warm clothing for the coming winter. "Kade, this is too much. Figured you could use it. Winters here get cold, even in Nevada." She ran her fingers over the supple leather, tears shining in her eyes. "No one has given me something this thoughtful in a long time. Then people have not been paying attention." She looked at him, really looked at him, and Kade saw the moment the last of her defenses crumbled. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face against his chest. He held her carefully, aware of how fragile this moment was, how easy it would be to break the trust they had been building. "Stay," she whispered against his shirt. "Please stay." "For how long? As long as you want." Kade tightened his arms around her, breathing in the scent of sage and sunlight that clung to her hair. "What if what I want is forever?" She pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes searching his face. Is that what you want? I think it might be. Then stay forever. She rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. Stay forever and help me build a life here. Kade kissed her back, pouring all the loneliness and hope and desperate affection he felt into that single connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. I will need to go back to the mountains sometimes. It is part of who I am. I know, and I will be here when you come back. What if you came with me sometimes? Not all the time, but when the weather is good and you want to see the high country. Her smile was brighter than the Nevada sun. I would like that. They talked long into the night, making plans and promises, building the foundation of a future neither had expected to find. Kade explained that he had a cabin in the mountains, small but sturdy, and a life built from solitude and survival. Vera described her dreams of expanding her garden, maybe getting some chickens and a milk cow, building something sustainable from the harsh desert land. We can do both, Kade said. Spend winters here where it is easier, summers in the mountains where it is cooler. Learn to live between two worlds. A life split between the high country and the desert. Yes, with you that sounds perfect. Over the following months, they built that life together with the same determination Kade had brought to digging the well. He helped Vera expand her garden, using his knowledge of the land to find the best places for different crops. She taught him to read again, a skill he had mostly abandoned in the mountains, and they spent evenings by lamplight with borrowed books and shared stories. The people of Tonopah watched their courtship with interest and approval. Kade was no longer the distant mountain man who appeared only to trade furs. He became a fixture in Vera's life, and by extension, in the community. He helped repair buildings, dug another well for an elderly couple on the west side of town, and slowly built relationships with the people he had spent years avoiding. Vera blossomed under the attention and support, her natural warmth drawing people to her. She organized community gatherings, helped with new arrivals to town, and became known as someone who would lend a hand to anyone in need. Together, they became a team, complementing each other's strengths and supporting each other's weaknesses. When Kade proposed on a cool evening in late October, kneeling beside the well he had dug all those months ago, Vera said yes before he could even finish the question. They married in early November, a simple ceremony in the small church with half the town in attendance. Kade wore new clothes that felt strange and constricting, but the look in Vera's eyes when she saw him waiting at the altar made every uncomfortable moment worthwhile. Their wedding night was spent in the cabin beside the well, the building they had both come to think of as home. Kade was gentle with her, mindful that she had been alone for so long, and Vera met him with equal measures of tenderness and passion. They learned each other slowly, mapping the geography of their bodies with the same care they had used to learn each other's hearts. I love you, Vera whispered in the darkness, her head resting on his chest. I did not think I would ever love again, but I love you. I love you too, Kade replied, the words still new and strange on his tongue but absolutely true. You brought me back to life. They settled into married life with surprising ease, finding joy in the small moments and strength in each other during the hard times. Kade continued to hunt and trap, bringing in money from the furs and meat, while Vera's garden became productive enough to sell surplus vegetables in town. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable and, more importantly, they were happy. The first winter was harsh, with snow falling even in the desert and temperatures dropping below freezing for weeks at a time. But the cabin was warm, the well kept producing clean water, and they had each other. Kade taught Vera to read animal tracks in the snow, and she taught him to cook dishes that were more complex than the simple camp food he had survived on for years. In the spring, they traveled to the mountains together, riding up into the high country where Kade's cabin stood waiting. Vera fell in love with the wilderness as deeply as he had, marveling at the towering pines and crystalline streams, the wildlife that moved through the forest like shadows, and the vast silence that settled over everything like a benediction. "I understand now," she said one morning as they sat outside the mountain cabin, watching the sunrise paint the peaks gold and rose. "I understand why you spent so long up here." "It is easier to think in the mountains," Kade agreed. "Easier to hear yourself." "But it is better with you here," Vera said, taking his hand. "Everything is better when we are together." They spent 3 months in the high country that summer, living off the land in each other's company. Kade taught Vera to fish and track, to identify edible plants and dangerous animals, to read the weather in the shape of the clouds. She brought a softness to his wild existence, reminding him that strength did not always mean solitude, that vulnerability could be its own kind of courage. When they returned to Tonopah in late August, Vera was carrying their first child. She had suspected for a few weeks but waited to tell him until they were back in the desert, standing beside the well where their story had begun. "We are going to have a baby," she said, watching his face carefully for his reaction. Kade went very still, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face, transforming his usually serious features into something approaching joy. "A baby?" "Yes." He swept her into his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests. "We are going to have a baby. Careful. You will make me dizzy." He set her down gently, his hands moving to her stomach with reverent care. "Are you feeling all right? You need to see a doctor." "Should you be riding?" "I am fine, Kade. Women have been having babies for a very long time. We know how to do this." But despite her reassurances, Kade spent the next several months in a state of protective anxiety. He baby-proofed the cabin, built a beautiful cradle from pine he hauled down from the mountains, and drove Vera slightly crazy with his constant concern for her welfare. She bore it all with patience and good humor, understanding that his fear came from love and the memories of what he had lost before. Their son was born on a warm April evening, arriving into the world with a lusty cry that echoed across the desert. Kade held the tiny, squirming bundle with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face as he counted fingers and toes and marveled at the miracle of new life. "He is perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Vera, he is perfect." "Yes, he is." She looked up at her husband from her bed, exhausted but radiant. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names for months, going back and forth on options that honored their pasts while looking toward the future. In the end, they chose William James Brennan, after Kade's father and Vera's late husband, a bridge between the lives they had lost and the life they were building together. William grew into a sturdy, happy child who loved nothing more than following his father around and exploring the world with fearless curiosity. He learned to walk in the desert and the mountains, equally at home in both environments. Kade taught him to track and hunt, to respect the wilderness and understand its rhythms. Vera taught him to read and write, to be kind and thoughtful, to use his strength in service of others. 2 years after William was born, they welcomed a daughter, Sarah Rose, who had her mother's honey-colored hair and her father's blue eyes. She was quieter than her brother, more contemplative, content to sit and watch the world rather than charging through it. Kade adored her, this tiny girl who could wrap him around her finger with a single smile. Life settled into a comfortable pattern. They spent summers in the mountains and the rest of the year in Tonopah, raising their children between two worlds and teaching them to love both. Kade's mountain cabin was expanded to accommodate the growing family, and Vera's desert garden became a small farm, with chickens and goats and eventually a pair of milk cows. The years passed in a blur of skinned knees and bedtime stories, of hard work and deep satisfaction. Kade never lost his connection to the wilderness, still spending some time alone in the high country, but he always came home. Home was wherever Vera was, wherever their children were, wherever love had grown in the harsh soil of loss and loneliness. On their 10th anniversary, Kade took Vera back to the well, the place where everything had changed. It was evening, the same time of day when he had first climbed out of that hole, exhausted and bleeding and full of hope he had not known he still possessed. "You remember the first night we met?" he asked, pulling her close against his chest. "How could I forget? A strange mountain man was destroying his hands digging a well outside my cabin. I was not that strange. You were covered in dirt and blood and refused to explain why you were helping me. I had my reasons." She turned in his arms, looking up at him with eyes that still made his heart race. "Yes, you did. And I am grateful every day that you saw me walking with those buckets. So am I." He kissed her softly, a kiss that held a decade of love and partnership and shared struggle. "So am I." They stood together in the fading light, listening to the sounds of their children playing nearby, the murmur of the desert evening settling over the land. The well still stood, as strong and dependable as the day Kade had finished it, providing water for their family and the garden that fed them. "I have been thinking," Vera said, her head resting against his shoulder, "about digging another well. Oh, there is a family that moved in about a mile south of here. They are having the same problem I had, walking too far for water. I thought maybe we could help them." Kade smiled, feeling the warmth of pride and love spread through his chest. Of course she wanted to help. It was who she was, who they both were now. People who had been helped and wanted to pass that kindness forward. "We can do that," he said. "Together." "Together," she agreed. And so they did. Over the years that followed, Kade and Vera Brennan became known as the people who dug wells for those who needed them. They did not charge for the labor, asking only that the materials be paid for and that the recipients help someone else when they had the chance. It became a tradition in Tonopah, a story that was told to new arrivals and shared around fires on cold nights. The story of the mountain man who saw a woman walking miles for water and dug her a well before sunrise. The story of how love could grow in the harshest soil if you were willing to do the work. The story of two lonely people who found each other and built a life that mattered, one bucketful of earth at a time. William grew into a strong young man who split his time between working a claim in the mountains and helping expand his parents' small farm. He married a girl from town, a sweet-natured woman named Elizabeth, and gave Kade and Vera their first grandchildren, twin boys who were as wild and fearless as their grandfather had been. Sarah became a teacher, opening a small school in Tonopah and dedicating herself to educating the children of miners and ranchers and everyone in between. She married late, to a gentle man who was a deputy sheriff, and they had 3 daughters who filled the world with laughter and music. Kade and Vera watched their family grow with satisfaction and joy. They had built something that would outlast them, a legacy of kindness and hard work and love that refused to quit. The well that started it all still produced clean water, as reliable and steady as the love that had grown beside it. As they grew older, they spent more time in Tonopah and less in the mountains, their bodies no longer quite up to the demands of wilderness living. But Kade never lost his love for the high country, and on good days, he would saddle a horse and ride up into the hills, breathing the pine-scented air and remembering the man he had been before Vera walked into his life. She always welcomed him home with open arms, never resentful of the time he spent in the wild places. She understood that the mountains were part of him, as essential as breathing, and she would not have changed him if she could. On a warm evening in their 40th year of marriage, Kade and Vera sat on the porch of their desert home, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Their children were grown and gone, building their own lives, but they visited often, bringing grandchildren and great-grandchildren to learn the stories and values that had built this family. "You have any regrets?" Vera asked, her hand clasped in Kade's, their fingers intertwined in a grip that had never weakened over the decades. "Not a single one," Kade replied, his voice still deep and strong despite the years. "You? Only that I did not meet you sooner." He smiled, the expression softening the weathered lines of his face. "We found each other when we needed to. That is what matters." "Yes," she agreed, "that is what matters." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had learned long ago that the best conversations often happened without words. The well stood beside the cabin, its bucket hanging ready, a monument to the love that had started with a simple act of kindness and grown into something that would echo through generations. Kade thought about that day on the ridge when he had seen Vera walking with her buckets, the moment that changed everything. He had been a man half alive, going through the motions of existence without really living. But she had awakened something in him, a desire to connect and build and love again. And Vera thought about returning to her cabin that evening to find a stranger digging a well, the bizarre and beautiful gesture that showed her not everyone in the world was cruel or indifferent. Kade had given her more than water, he had given her hope, and from that hope had grown a love that sustained her through every challenge life threw their way. "I love you," Kade said, the words as true and necessary as they had been the first time he spoke them. "I love you too," Vera replied, squeezing his hand. "Always and forever." The sun dipped below the horizon, and the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled and the desert settled into its nightly rhythms. Inside the cabin, the cradle Kade had built 4 decades ago sat waiting for the next generation, still strong and beautiful, a symbol of continuity and family. They had built a good life, Kade and Vera Brennan. A life forged from loss and loneliness, tempered by hard work and dedication, polished by love and partnership until it shone. They had raised children who knew the value of helping others, who understood that strength was nothing without kindness, that the measure of a person was found in what they did for those who could not repay them. The well had been the beginning, but their love was the foundation everything else was built on. And that love would continue long after they were gone, living on in their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in every person who drank from a well they had helped dig, in every story told about the mountain man, and the woman he loved enough to move earth and stone to help. As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, they rose from the porch and went inside together, Kade's arm around Vera's shoulders, her head resting against his chest. They had walked this path thousands of times, but it never got old, never lost its sweetness. Every day with her was a gift, and Kade treasured each one. They prepared for bed with the ease of long practice, moving around each other in the small cabin like dancers who knew every step. When they finally settled under the quilts Vera had made over the years, each one a story in fabric and thread, Kade pulled her close and breathed in the familiar scent of her hair. "Thank you," he whispered into the darkness. "For what?" "For walking that road with those buckets. For letting me dig you a well, for building this life with me." Vera smiled against his shoulder. "Thank you for seeing me, for caring enough to help, for loving me." They drifted off to sleep together, as they had every night for 40 years, secure in the knowledge that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. The well outside their door stood silent and strong, a reminder that the simplest acts of kindness could change everything, that love could grow anywhere if you were willing to do the work, and that sometimes the best things in life started with seeing someone struggle and deciding you could not walk away. The story of Kade and Vera Brennan became legend in Tonopah and the surrounding territories. Parents told it to their children as an example of true love and selfless kindness. Young couples repeated their vows at the well, hoping some of that enduring love would bless their own marriages. And every summer, on the anniversary of the night Kade dug that first well, the community gathered to celebrate, to dig wells for those who needed them, and to remember that in a harsh world, kindness was the most revolutionary act. Years turned into decades, and Kade and Vera lived to see their great-grandchildren grow and start families of their own. They became the patriarch and matriarch of a clan that spread across Nevada and beyond, all of them carrying the values and lessons learned at the foot of two people who refused to let loss define them. When Kade finally passed away at the age of 87, it was peacefully in his sleep, with Vera beside him as she had been for nearly 50 years. He dreamed of mountains and clear water, of a younger Vera walking with buckets, of the moment he decided that loneliness was not inevitable, that love was worth the risk of loss. Vera lived another 3 years, spending her days with family and friends, tending the garden that had grown from a few struggling plants into a lush oasis. She visited the well every day, sometimes just standing beside it, remembering the night a mountain man destroyed his hands to give her a gift she had not known she desperately needed. When she joined Kade in the small cemetery on the hill above Tonopah, the entire community turned out to say goodbye. They buried her beside him, under a headstone that read simply, "Kade and Vera Brennan, they dug wells and built love." The cabin and the well were maintained by their descendants, becoming a historical site that people visited to hear the story and be inspired by it. The well still produced clean, cold water, as reliable after 100 years as it had been on the first day. It became a symbol for the whole community, a reminder that the greatest gifts come from the heart, that love is an action as much as a feeling, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is help someone carry their burden. And on quiet desert evenings, when the sun painted the sky and the stars began to emerge, people swore they could feel the presence of Kade and Vera near the well, still together, still building and loving and showing by example that the measure of a life was not in what you took, but in what you gave. The mountain man had seen a woman walking miles to fetch water, and he dug her a well before sunrise. But more than that, he gave her his heart, and she gave him hers in return, and together they built something that would outlast them both. A legacy of love that would flow through generations like water from a deep well, pure and clear and life-giving, forever and always.